Hey folks, and welcome back to the channel. Topic for today is triple 4K screens for sim racing. Those of you that have been with the channel at least a couple of months will know that I recently switched over to triple 4K panels. Previously I was running triple 1440p, and to be honest, it's been a bit of a journey getting there to try and replicate stable and stutter-free frame rates with a level of graphic settings that I found acceptable, and I learned a whole bunch of stuff along the way around software, things to tweak in Windows, and things just generally to get things running a bit more smoothly. So if you currently have triple 4K panels and are just looking for a little bit of guidance around where you can maybe get a little bit more performance, optimize your setup further, hopefully there'll be a couple of things in this video for you. And if you are considering going down the triple 4K panel route at some point in the next 6, 12, 18 months, I'm going to talk through things like minimum requirements and just my experience of making the switch from 1440p to 4K and some of the things that I've learned along the way, because it hasn't necessarily been a simple transition. I kind of hoped it would be more plug and play than it was, but to be honest, it took a good 6 to 8 weeks of just tweaking settings within Windows, within iRacing, checking some of the hardware just to get things running smoothly. But now it runs fantastic, and it has been a fantastic upgrade. But as I said, it is a little bit of a journey to get there, and I just wanted to share some of the things I learned along the way. So first of all, let's talk quickly about minimum requirements from a PC standpoint, just to make sure that your current hardware, or if you're going to build or buy a new PC, the hardware that you select is going to be capable of running triple 4K. As with the current hardware, it's certainly doable, but you do tend to need to have a particularly strong GPU, a pretty strong CPU in order to make the system run well. I use AMD CPUs, so I'm more knowledgeable in that space. So I'm going to start there. From my perspective, from a CPU, if you're going AMD, it's well known now the X3D processors are particularly strong in sim racing titles. The more pixels you're pushing, yes, that's more drawing for the GPU, but it's also more work for the CPU as well. So my recommendation, I think the minimum requirement would be a 5800 X3D, assuming you can even get those these days. I know they're in pretty hard supply. And that's also going to put you on an older platform where you're only running DDR4 RAM. So you could start there, but if you can, I think you want to start with the 7800 X3D. Doesn't have to be an X3D processor, but for me, that's always going to be the right one to buy from a sim racing perspective if you're going with AMD. I'm currently running a 9800 X3D. I think the difference between that and the 7800 X3D will be there, but not big enough to make that jump. If you're building a new system and you can get your hands on a 9800 X3D, fantastic, that's the way to go. If you already have a 7800 X3D, no need to jump up one. That will be more than enough CPU for what you need. On the Intel side, I'm just not as close to the different SKUs that they have. My recommendation there, you're probably going to be looking at 12th gen onwards in terms of the kind of CPUs to be picking from. Just know the 13th and 14th gen did have those instability issues. I do think it's largely been resolved now if you are buying a brand new 13th or 14th gen, but please do your research on that. And it's not all going to be about core count, just like it isn't for the X3D CPUs on the AMD side. It's not necessarily you need to get the absolute most cores, for the Intel CPU. So do your research, but you're looking for a strong Intel CPU performer from a gaming perspective, and I would probably look at 12th gen and later to get the job done for triple 4K panels. So let's talk the GPU. You're going to want to spend a bit more of your budget on this one. It's most likely going to be the limiting factor on 4K screens. Having 3 of those, pushing that many pixels, unless you have a really poorly performing CPU, the bottleneck will almost certainly be your GPU. So what does that mean? Yes, you'll be looking towards the higher end. It doesn't have to be the absolute latest and greatest. From an NVIDIA standpoint, the 30 series, 3080 and above, 40 series, 4080 and above If by some miracle you can get your hand on a 5080 or a 5090, then of course they will look after you well. So expect to spend a little bit more, look towards that higher end, and the same would apply for the current AMD offerings as well. But there's two really important factors to think about. One will be the VRAM available. I don't have a minimum for you, but you're probably going to be looking from 16 and above. Maybe you can get away with 12, but pushing that many pixels, the more VRAM you have, the better. Hence, why you'd be looking at some of the higher end cards. But the most important thing outside of VRAM is what is the bandwidth that the GPU has that you're currently looking at. Example for me, I'm running a 4090 in my system currently. I have these 4K panels which can run at 240 Hertz each. However, the 4090 can only run these triple 4Ks if they're set to 120 Hertz in Windows. If I set them any higher, the 4090 will simply turn off one of the displays. So those are really the two things to be thinking about. Take a look at the VRAM, do that comparison. If you've got a number of cards in mind, know that that's going to be an important aspect of the GPU, but also double check that the GPU does have enough bandwidth to put out at a minimum 120 Hertz across all three 4K panels that you'll have running. From a system RAM perspective, you're just looking to make the best choice for your system in terms of speed, compatibility. There's no special rules here when it comes to having system RAM specifically for triple 4K screens. In terms of capacity, I think you can get away with 16 gigabytes. Personally, I would go with 32. The difference in price between the two kits usually isn't too much. But if you're going from 32 up to 64 or considering it, don't expect that to give you any real world benefit from triple 4K screens. You're better off saving your money there, sticking with 32 and trying to put a little bit of extra budget into either the CPU or more likely into the GPU. And finally, PSUs or power supplies. Don't skimp in this area. You don't need to have the highest rated power supply that you can find, but the wattage capacity is going to be important. If you're on the fence between, say, an 850 watt or a 1000 watt, if I were you, I would stretch to 1000 watt or maybe even the 1200 watt. The reason for that, if you've got triple 4K screens and you're making that investment, probably one of the first upgrades you'll do, in the next 12, 18 months, 2 years, is going to be to move the GPU on. That's likely to be the biggest bottleneck. And until we start to see more significant efficiency gains with GPUs, they continue to pull more and more power. So the last thing you want when you're driving along and beautiful triple 4K is for those power spikes to give you instability, or worst of all, to kind of cut you off mid-race. So make sure you've got good headroom. I personally wouldn't go lower than 1000 watt power supply. It's what I currently have in my system, but if I was able to get my hands on a 5090 at some point this year, I may consider going up to 1200, again, just to rebuild that headroom, which I currently have with my 4090, but would quite quickly extinguish with the power requirements for a 5090. If you're heading down the 4K triple route, of course, you need to select the panel size, the panel type, and select from a bunch of other different qualities that different 4K panels have. So let's just take a couple of minutes to take a look at that. Now, this is the rtings.com site. No idea if that's how you say it. This, if you haven't seen this site before, is a fantastic site. It probably doesn't have every single monitor out there reviewed, but most of the monitors that I've looked at over the years when I've been upgrading, changing, be it for work and office or indeed for my 4K triples that I'm currently using, I'll often come here first to see, A, has it been reviewed, and if yes, what do they say about it? Doesn't mean it's the only review. Of course, getting real reviews from people that have used it week in, week out for gaming and for other uses, look far and wide when you've kind of got a handful of monitors that you're looking at. But this, for me, I do recommend. It's a great starting point to get a objective view of the overall performance of a particular monitor and then how it compares with others in its category. So I just did a quick search, 5 best 4K monitors winter 2025, and the intent here is to not recommend a particular monitor. I'm not super worried about that. What I wanted to use it for, though, is just to show you some of the different characteristics that you're going to want to think about as you're making your selection. So let's start here with the size. So this particular panel is 27-inch. Now, 27-inch or 32-inch, you'll find good options for both at 4K resolution. Personal preference. I don't think it's right or wrong. You may prefer the 27-inch. Maybe you have the screens a little bit closer to you than I do, or you prefer the 32-inch with the bigger rear estate. Some people, obviously, if you have the screens much further back, you can get even bigger panels. But of course, the price increases. So sweet spot is going to be the 27 or 32. If you're already running triples, you probably have a preference, and there's no real need to change that when you are upgrading to a 4K panel. Now, the pixel type, as it's called here, I'll just leave that on screen. Type of pixel used in the display. Most common, IPS, VA, TN, and OLED. This also would be personal preference, but it's tricky to make a decision on this without actually seeing the monitors in person. So my recommendation, even if you can't see the exact monitor that you're looking at in, a store like Best Buy, etc., try to go to a store where you can at least see how the different pixel technology shows up in person, and there is generally quite a bit of difference between looking at an OLED screen versus looking at an IPS screen or a VA screen. And honestly, I still think this is all about personal preference. For me, one of the changes that I made, I think the old screens I had, they were 1440p of course, but they were IPS in plane switching, and now the Alienware triples I have are OLED. Huge difference for me, mainly around the quality of the blacks, which is a common positive with an OLED screen. So I love that, and I think it would be difficult for me now to move away from OLED unless another screen type, could render blacks as well. Especially because I'm often running endurance races and I'll be doing it in a more dim lit environment. So those deep and inky blacks are pretty awesome. But still, there's no right or wrong answer here. Do your research, try and see the different monitor types in person. Refresh rate. Again, this you'll know all about this, and you really can pick whichever one you want. The thing to think about here is you're trying to push triple 4K screens through your GPU. Therefore, you are not going to have an extremely high refresh rate like you could achieve in 1080p or to some extent in 1440p. So a max refresh rate for this particular monitor of 160, I think would be more than adequate, because I think most of the time you might struggle to hit that anyway, depending on the graphics setting you're running. The panels that I have are actually 240 Hertz, but I run them in 120 Hertz because I do not have the bandwidth on my 4090 to be able to push the 3 4K screens any higher than a 120 Hertz output for each monitor. Native resolution, of course, typically will be 3840 by 2160. If you're going any bigger than that, maybe you're getting more of an elongated screen. Of course, you're just adding more pixels to the mix. So with the current performance of graphics cards and systems in general, I'm not sure I'd recommend getting triples that are any bigger than 3840 by 2160. That should be plenty. Now, right above this here, you'll see HDR picture, SDR picture. This is one of the reasons I like coming to Artings, because I enjoy their explanation behind HDR and behind SDR to get behind some of the marketing material. HDR might not be a big deal for you. A lot of 4K panels will come with that because they're the higher end screens. They have the ability to do deeper blacks or to have a brighter picture. So again, look into that. I don't think it's a deal breaker for a 4K panel. I do have HDR enabled on the screens that I use. I do like it. Is it a huge difference from SDR? Probably not, honestly, when I'm gaming, but if I'm going to spend that much on a set of screens, why would I not have the HDR picture included as part of that? But still personal preference, and there is a big range between the quality of HDR that some monitors will put out versus others, and a site like Artings is a great way to get a good comparison of that. Another point that I think it's worth considering, and this really goes for any selection of monitor, not just because you're looking to move to 4K triples, but the variable refresh rate. You would expect to have that. Almost all strong gaming monitors will now, so that should be a given. But depending on the graphics card you have, you want to make sure that at a minimum, the variable refresh rate technology of the monitor is compatible with your GPU. So in my case, I've got a 4090, so it's an NVIDIA card. If I happen to be selecting this monitor, I would see that G-Sync is compatible, but it's also been tested, which I like. That means that it is fully verified to work with this monitor, so I should have absolutely no compatibility issues. So that's super. Some monitors, which may be FreeSync, still will be compatible with G-Sync. They just haven't been tested. And it either means it's just because manufacturers have not bothered to test it, but they could work fine, or it means they have been tested and they maybe do not perform to the standards that NVIDIA would like. Either way, make sure that the compatibility works, especially if you're doing cross-platform, i.e. G-Sync monitor with AMD graphics card or vice versa. At minimum, make sure you've got the compatibility there. And ideally, try and pair them. If you've got an AMD graphics card, why not pick a FreeSync monitor that is going to work really well and just in harmony with it. So it's not generally a problem because now things are cross-compatible when it comes to these two technologies, but it doesn't hurt to pair the GPU variable refresh rate technology with the monitor, again, just to eliminate another point of failure. Now, another thing that we haven't talked about would be input lag, and there are other elements, of course, when it comes to choosing a monitor. I'm not going to talk about those because they're not specific to 4K panels. They'd go for any panels. But again, do the research. Sites like this are fantastic because you can compare different monitors side by side. I spent a long time doing that before making my current selection, trying to get a good balance of the quality, of the picture, depending on the panel that I chose, low input lag, variable refresh rate compatibility, and a frame rate or FPS or Hertz level that I was going to be happy with in game. And in effect, 240 is far more than I need. 120 would have been fine, but the panels that I selected really hit it out the park for me in other areas and were also on deal at the time. So 4K panels, there's a few additional things to think about, but in general, it's exactly the same research that you would do for any other monitor that you would have bought for your system in the past. Let's talk through some basic hardware setup, and we'll start with cable choice. Now, obviously, if you're going to use the cables that come with the monitor, you're going to be fine because they will be rated to work at whatever the max resolution and refresh rate is for that monitor, which is great. I know a lot of us, though, will need to buy extension cables or just longer versions of whether it's DisplayPort or HDMI cables because the PC might not be particularly close to the rig. So I've just opened Amazon here, and the reason for doing that is my search. You can probably see 10-foot 4K DisplayPort cable. There will be a huge variety of choice when you're looking for aftermarket cables, which is not a bad thing. But what I find really challenging is the variation in price can go from $15, $12 here all the way up to $45. And what does that mean? Are some cables better than others? What do you need to look out for? Because it is quite possible to buy what you think is the right, let's say, DisplayPort cable, plug it in, and then have the screen not perform as expected, or to not be able to get through the 4K bandwidth that the cable needs to have. So first of all, do your research. If you're using DisplayPort, something that I will often look out for is whether the cable is VESA certified. And then if so, specifically what DisplayPort version can the cable run. The ones I'm running, just out of interest here, is these DisplayPort cable 1.4. That is the maximum that these panels can put out. They're using 1.4 DisplayPort technology, not the newer, I think it's 2.1, which I assume is on the 5090 and the 5080 and the newer graphics cards. It's VESA certified. I've used Cable Matters a lot, and there'll be other brands like that that have a sort of a long history of making high quality cables. But I guess the short advice here is don't cheap out on the cable, and especially if you're buying a cable that's 8 foot, 10 foot, 20 foot even, because they probably exist. The longer the cable, the better quality that cable has got to be to carry the signal over that distance. So if you can get the shortest cable that's going to work between your PC and your monitor, but if you do have a bit of an extended track, no worries, but take the time to do research on the cable and don't assume that the cheapest one or the first one that appears is going to do the job. So Visa certified for sure if you're picking up a DisplayPort cable, but also just do a bit of research, read the reviews, check other sites like Artings around cable quality, just to make sure you've got the right quality aftermarket cable to support the bandwidth requirements for each screen. Next up would be monitor firmware, and this is pretty easy to overlook because monitors you don't typically associate with having to do software updates. You buy them and they're good to go. But with the newer 4K panels, as they're kind of pushing the technology, it's not that unusual these days for there to be firmware updates to address issues. And of course, with the high bandwidth requirements, you are going to want to be running the most up-to-date and stable firmware for your monitors. So this is the monitor that I have, and you can see here there was a device firmware update as recently as the 25th of April. Now, the first thing I did when I saw this and fired up the monitors for the first time was just to double check the version. Unfortunately, my 3 monitors are all running the most up-to-date firmware, so I didn't have to do anything here. But especially if you're buying, brand new bleeding edge monitor, there's a good chance in the first 6 months of it being out that there will be patches released via firmware that will fix potential issues. You don't have to do that if you're not experiencing issues. Sometimes it's safer just to leave it as it is, but if you are, it's certainly worth doing the research to understand what the firmware is supposed to fix, and it is not something that will just get passed down through Windows Update. You'll need to manually look at the support site, download it, and then follow the instructions for updating the firmware on each of the monitors. And lastly, when you fire up each of the monitors for the first time, there's a couple of things I would check in the monitor's own on-screen display. First of all will be, what is the color palette that it is running? Likely to be something like sRGB, but there's almost always going to be a selection of 2, 3, 4, or 5, and so you want to do the research on what the color palettes are, take a look at the screen, see how it adjusts it, and then try and mirror it up to whatever setting that you have in Windows, so it is the right color palette for the display that you are trying to get to in Windows. And what I mean by that is if you're running HDR display in Windows, then there's likely to be a HDR color palette that you should select on the monitor itself. So worth just kind of double checking, what's the color palette that is running by default? Do you like it? And does it align with how you want to run the display in Windows and in the game? Second thing, usually the refresh rate for the monitor, it'll just take whatever Windows is showing. But if for any reason you're struggling to get the advertised refresh rate, just double check in the on-screen display for each of the monitors that it's not artificially set in there. I haven't really seen that. I've seen a couple of examples occasionally that has fixed a problem for someone. So I don't think it's particularly widespread. But if you think that might be an issue, just double check refresh rate and make sure it's not being limited, as I said, on the monitor itself. And then finally, HDR versus SDR. Again, this should just be driven by Windows sending that HDR signal to the monitor, but there could be a physical switch inside that on-screen display for each of the monitors, which tells it to either accept HDR or not. And if it's set to not, then Windows won't even recognize it as a HDR display. So I didn't have to do that with mine. As soon as I clicked HDR in Windows, I was good to go. But if you believe you have a HDR display, but Windows is not seeing it, take a quick look in the on-screen display for each of the monitors and just double check there's not a setting there to switch it on or off. So you bought your monitors, you've hooked them up, you've plugged them all in to your GPU, and let's just, for argument's sake, say at least one of them is working, so you can get into Windows and then you can start making the display adjustments. In a perfect world, when you plug all three in, hopefully if you just reboot the PC, everything will come to life. For me, that wasn't the case though. So as I said earlier in the video, each of my panels can run at 240 Hertz, and that would be considered the default. So when I restarted the computer, I only got 2 screens working, despite the fact all 3 were plugged in. Drove me nuts. Could not understand it. Didn't know anything about bandwidth at that particular time. I just was frustrated that it wasn't as plug and play as 1440p. An hour or so later, I eventually understood that the reason for that, as I've said, was the 4090, and probably that will go back into the 30 series generation as well, can only run 3 4K panels at a maximum of 120 Hertz. Once I've made that change, all 3 panels came alive and I was good to go. But that's something that you have to think about right from the off. But if you are having any issues, best place to go initially, from my perspective, is jump straight into Windows, System, Display. First of all, does it recognize each of the monitors? So mine, of course, here are set up fine. I have a 4th monitor that is plugged into my CPU onboard graphics. We'll come back to that in a minute, but just know that the 1, 3, and 2 that you're looking at here are all plugged in to the 4090. Rearrange them if you need to rearrange them. Normal stuff there. If you are using HDR, have HDR on. Another thing that can be interesting, you can also download quite often color profiles from the monitor's support site. So you can see there's an Alienware color profile here, which I am using because it's for HDR. I'm running in HDR. I don't know if it makes a massive difference, to be honest, to what I was seeing previously, but I expect that to be a calibrated color profile that will work better with Windows. So I've downloaded it, quite happy with it, but just something to look at. If you don't have that, check the monitor support site, see if they have anything for download. So you make your decision on HDR, and it's not a default that you want it on. Some people prefer running an SDR, totally understand that. Scale, whatever suits you. Check the display resolution is indeed running in 4K. Sounds obvious, but you never know. Sometimes monitors can boot up and they can be running in 1440p or something odd. So just make sure that they are indeed set to run at the right resolution. And then I always go into advanced display, because this is just a slightly easier way to see all of that information on a single page. So you can check the desktop mode, active signal mode. Great, we're running at the right resolution. We're running at 120 Hertz. Now, if you see here, I can actually now select 239.97, but the moment I do that, it's going to turn one of the screens off, which of course is no good. So that's why I'm set at 120 and not at the default maximum. So if you are running triple 4K screens and you don't have a 50 series GPU, then you will be capped to 120 Hertz almost certainly. So as I said, if you're having any trouble getting any of your monitors showing up, this would be the first place to come. Double check that you're only asking each of those monitors to run at 120 Hertz. As we look further down here, you've got the bit depth, the color format. Great. It's confirming that we're running in HDR. This particular monitor actually has a HDR certification, peak brightness, 460 nits, etc. Great. And then you can just do that for all of your screens. So my screens are identical. So I hit display 2, same information. Hit display 3, same information. So this is a really good place just to start initially to make sure, does Windows see that I have all 3 attached? Am I running at the right Hertz for each of the monitors? Are they arranged correctly? And then if I'm trying to run in HDR, is that all working correctly for each of the 3 monitors? The next Windows setting to take a quick look at is called Game Mode. Now, by default, in most modern builds of Windows 11, and I'm guessing in Windows 10 as well, this will be defaulted to on. Kind of makes sense. If you're running a game, you have game mode on. Windows prioritizes the game, gives you as much performance as possible. However, if you're running windowed borderless, which for those of us that are running overlays or a bunch of companion apps, you may well be, then game mode can actually impede performance. Now, I'm not an expert on game mode, so please do the research. There's quite a bit out there in Reddit and on other forums in terms of what does game mode do, why is it beneficial, or why can it be a hindrance. And if you're just running a single game and you're running it in full screen and there's no other apps running that you use as companion apps for your sim, then you can probably just leave game mode on. Not worry about it. good to go. However, if you're running window borderless, and especially if you're encountering stutters when you're running overlays or other companion apps, it's a pretty good idea to turn game mode off. My limited understanding is game mode, when it is on, can prioritize the performance of the particular game running, which is great unless it's impeding the performance of the companion apps such as overlays. And if they're not getting the level of performance needed and they are causing stutters themselves, then of course those stutters can come into the gameplay. So if you look on the forums around RaceLab and other overlays, one of the recommendations is to run the overlays with game mode off, and I can confirm it's a change that I made about 3 weeks ago, as I was just getting rid of the final stutters of moving back into overlays on these 4K panels, and it did make a difference. I could tell from before and after. I tested it a couple of times, and it did get rid of some of the stutters that I was seeing. So just so you know where to find that, into settings here, down to gaming, and then game mode, and optimize your PC for play by turning things off in the background. And some of the stuff it does may be very helpful, but as I said, if it is in any way impeding your companion apps, then they have a performance issue that can just flow through into the game. So recommendation, if you're running windowed borderless, is to turn game mode off, or at the very least just try it, because in triple 4K scenarios you're going to want the maximum performance possible, and for me it would not have been possible to run my overlays without turning this setting off. So definitely something to think about. Let's cover the graphics apps themselves. So, NVIDIA, AMD, Intel graphics card. You're going to see NVIDIA here because I'm running a 4090. The most obvious thing is make sure you're running the latest drivers. The only reason you wouldn't want to be running the latest drivers is if there is a confirmed issue with a particular driver that is having an impact on, screens in general, or the type of screen you have. You do see on the forums and Reddit, people staying 2 or 3 driver versions behind if they're seeing struggles with stutters or screen misbehavior. So it does pay to do some research, but from my experience, I am generally running on the latest driver, unless there's been a particular call out or an issue with a driver version that's been posted. But I don't have it set to auto update. I do a little bit of research before I update each time, just to make sure that I have full control over what driver I'm running. Now, in terms of settings, let's just bring that up. So this is the NVIDIA app. We are looking at program settings. So this is settings that are specifically set for iRacing. And in general here, everything is pretty much set to default. G-Sync compatible, etc. for the monitor technology. The only thing that I change in here is my power management mode, and I have prefer maximum performance. This is not a 4K triple thing. This is something I had set when I had 1440p, just to try and keep the boost clocks as high as possible when I'm in iRacing. Personal preference, just note this is a setting you can play with. And again, because we're pushing the GPU so hard, you do want to try and leverage every ounce of performance that it has available. If we go to the global settings, again, almost all of this is just bog standard. The only thing that I have increased recently is the shader cache size. And let's see if we can see what it is. Controls the maximum amount of disk space the driver may use for storing shader compiles. I doubt it ever really gets to 100 gigabyte, but if you have a plentiful hard drive, there's no harm in pushing this up. You probably won't see a performance increase, and the default is probably just fine. However, you can see, as it says on the screen, this will, or at least it should, reduce stuttering and startup time of applications. So if you've got the space, pushed it up a little bit higher. Again, you're just trying to extract the most performance out of your GPU as you can. We discussed G-Sync and FreeSync technology a little bit earlier in the video. So of course you do want to make sure that it is active and you are indeed getting your variable refresh rate. So if I just click on system here, you can see that indeed it is confirmed that all 3 of my triples are running G-Sync, and you've got the button here that says that it's switched on. Even if these were not G-Sync certified monitors, I would still have the opportunity to switch it on as long as there is some compatibility. But whatever it is, whether you're running an AMD GPU, NVIDIA GPU, if you're using variable refresh rate, do a double check that it is running. I see no reason not to use variable refresh rate. Should reduce tearing in game, and so it shouldn't be any different for a 4K panel than it would be for any other. It is one of the things, if you're really struggling, that you can turn off and just see if it makes a difference. But I would say by default you want to be running G-Sync or FreeSync, just so you can get the most from the 4K panel and make the most of that variable refresh rate technology. The final monitor setting that you'll often have to decide what to do with is called V-Sync. Now, when I was running my 1440p triples, I used to have G-Sync enabled, Reflex enable, which is an NVIDIA low latency technology, and also V-Sync enabled. They work great together. V-Sync capped the frame rate on its own, and then G-Sync kind of handled the variable refresh rate. Everything worked in tandem super well. When I tried that combination on these 4K panels, it did not work as expected. V-Sync wasn't really capping where I thought it should be, and I was really struggling to get stutter-free gameplay when I had V-Sync active. So right now, just so that all of you can see, I have vertical sync set to use the 3D application setting. Sorry, that's in iRacing. So use the 3D application setting, and I do not have VSync active in iRacing, which is the only sim that I run. So effectively, I run with vertical sync off, but I do manually cap the frame rate in iRacing at 115, so just below the refresh rate that I've set for each of these panels of 120. Now, that might not be the right way to go for you. So you may want to try G-Sync, V-Sync on with Reflex, see if it works as intended, but it is certainly one of the monitor technologies that you can play around with. And as I said, I've noticed no loss in performance by turning it off and just replacing it with a frame rate cap in iRacing as an alternative. A quick bit of advice on fourth screens when you're already running a triple 4K setup. When I initially set this up, I did what I'd done on my 1440p triples, which was plug all four screens into the GPU, so into the 4090. Once I'd adjusted the 4K panels to 120 Hz in Windows, I could see all four screens and it all looked to be running just fine, no issues. However, got into a game, got into the sim, and I noticed that when I was in the sim, it was capping the FPS in game to 75 Hz, which is the maximum Hertz of my full screen. Did not understand why, it was super frustrating. A couple of weeks later, came back to it and just swapped the full screen, plugged it into the onboard CPU graphics, which is probably what I should have done initially, and that seemed to break the reliance between the FPS cap that was coming up in the game when I had all four screens connected to the GPU, and then the game would run at the right FPS cap, which I'd set it to 115, and the four screen was not impeding it. So if you're running a four screen or you're running digital dashes that are coming up as extra screens through your system, through Windows, advice would be only put the 4K triples into your main graphics card. Any other screens, try and plug either into onboard graphics if you have it, that's the cleanest solution, or if you are really in a pinch and you happen to have an older graphics card lying around, you could potentially plug that into a spare PCIe slot if you have one, and then run those additional screens through that second graphics card. Because 4K triples are pushing almost the maximum bandwidth that even a 4090 can handle, my recommendation is only have the triples plugged into your main graphics card and try and find another solution for getting a full screen or digital dash up and running from your PC. GPU hardware acceleration is another important setting. Now, this would apply really to any triple screen setup in order to just release the GPU from having to do any extra work whilst you're sim racing. But again, because you're trying to extract the absolute maximum performance from your graphics card, and it is under so much load with the pixels it's having to push when you've got triple 4K, I think this setting becomes a little bit more important. And what it is GPU hardware acceleration. A number of apps outside of the sim, if you have them open, might be tapping the GPU, not heavily, but for certain tasks. So if you, for any reason, have a browser window open, maybe there's a fuel calculator or something that you're using live, or really any other companion apps such as overlays, whatever it might be, there is a possibility that that app has a setting called GPU hardware acceleration. Discord is another good example. Now, the difference in performance for the app itself, when that is selected on or off, I think is fairly minimal on modern systems, and it's better if the CPU is handling that load, because it's unlikely your CPU is maxed out when you're in the sim on 4K. It's much more likely to be the GPU which is kind of maxed out, and unless you have a low performing CPU, there will be some capacity there for it to carry out, some of those extra tasks that the companion apps are asking for. Just to show you what this can look like, this is Microsoft Edge. I don't happen to run with a browser window open, but just to show you some of the settings that are in here, and this is under System and Performance. Startup Boost. When this is on, it helps Edge open faster. This is probably not a particularly big performance hit, but it's likely using some system RAM. So, I'd rather it not, because I don't need it to start particularly fast. Continue running background extensions and apps when Microsoft Edge is closed. Well, unless those are extensions and apps that you need whilst racing, then you don't want that, because again, taking away performance that you might need. But here, use graphics acceleration when available. If that is ticked on, then it means that if Edge is open, and if there is an app or a web page that is pulling on graphics acceleration, then it's going to be taking a little bit of performance away from your graphics card. So check your overlay apps if you use them. Check your internet, your web browsers, take a look at Discord, as that's another one. But really, any other apps that you have open whilst you're gaming, if you need the maximum performance, which of course, from a triple 4K setup, you need everything that the GPU can offer. This is just another area where it can just be sapping a little bit of performance away. So check the apps. Check if there is a graphics acceleration box to tick. If so, untick it. Try it. If you feel like it lets down the app performance and actually you need it ticked, then of course that's up to you. But I have this deselected on all of the apps where it's an option for the apps that I'm running as companion apps whilst I'm racing. And the last thing to think about from a Windows perspective might be whether you are overclocking your graphics card. Now, if you have no idea what overclocking is, but you're interested, well, do some research. There is tons of information about it on the internet, and it's very interesting. If you're a bit of a nerd like me, then it's something that you may well be interested in. In essence, can squeeze out a little bit more performance from the card at the cost of more heat, at the cost of more power draw, and potentially at the cost of shortening the lifespan of that particular component, so the GPU. So go into it eyes wide open, although it's fair to say that a mild overclock really shouldn't have a particularly detrimental impact on the longevity of the card, but it is something to bear in mind. You can see on screen here, I overclock using Afterburner. I have a very mild overclock in place for my 4090, just plus 100 on the core clock, plus 1000 on the memory. I have tried both of those sliders a little bit higher, and I can run with a little bit more performance, but I like to build in just a little bit of headroom for stability. And that's really the key thing. If you're overclocked and you're experiencing stutters with 4K triples, take the overclock off, see if that has an impact. But equally, if you are struggling to get the FPS that you're looking for with 4K triples, a mild overclock is not going to give you 10 to 20 FPS, but it could give you in the range of 2 to 5. Absolute maximum would be 10, but probably not quite there. And so it can be something to play with. But health warning, do your research. You are technically pushing the card harder than it was designed from factory. So understand what that means, understand the impact to the overall stability of the system, and you will need to test it. You don't want to do a blind overclock, jump into a race and just hope everything works. You're going to want to test it under load in a practice session with AI cars around, whatever it is. And to ensure stability, you never really want to push an overclock particularly far. A mild overclock, as I have here, just to gain a little bit more performance out of the card, absolutely fine. And don't just copy my settings blindly here, even if you have a 4090 FE, because every card is different. Silicon Lottery plays a role in terms of the potential performance still in the cars above what comes as stock. But it can be an interesting way just to squeeze a little bit more performance out of the GPU, which, given we're pushing it so hard, it can be useful. I've jumped into iRacing just to give you a quick tour around how to set up the graphics for 4K triples. Now, it is exactly the same as you would really for any other monitor type. So there's nothing specific that you need to do for 4K triples other than make sure you set the screen pixel resolution to the size of your 4K triples, which I'll show you. If you want to learn more in general about optimizing iRacing graphics in particular, I've got a couple of videos on it. The most recent one, I think, was from September or October in 2024, goes into a ton of detail into not only the in-sim graphics settings, but how to run the graphics configurator, the steps to take, what are some of the key changes you can make in the configuration, the .ini files for iRacing. So all of that detail you can find there. But I'm just going to call out some of the specifics today as it relates to 4K triples. So normally, if I'm setting up these triples for the first time, I would jump in here once I'm comfortable Windows is up and running. I would go to settings. Oh, looks like this has changed. Lovely. A little bit cleaner than it used to be in iRacing. And you can see graphic config here, or run graphics config. That would be the first thing that I would do. However, make sure you take a backup of your dx11.ini file, and I can just show you where you find that. Inside Documents, inside iRacing. If you're running monitors, of course, it should be called Render a DX11 Monitor. Make sure you back that up before running the graphics config, because it will overwrite it with a fresh copy and you will lose all of your prior settings. So that's the first thing to do, and the reason why that's important is it allows iRacing to have a fresh look at the monitors that you've got and just make sure that it understands that indeed your monitors have changed and that iRacing knows what's what when it comes to your newer panels. Once you have done that, typically then I would jump into the sim itself, make sure that just on a single screen I can see everything as expected. It won't have set up triples for you automatically there. Most of you already will know that. But if I'm happy with that, I'll then come to the DX11 monitor file, which you can see I've got open here. Now, a lot of these are related to settings that you can change in game, so I'll jump into the sim shortly so we can have a look at those. But what I wanted to bring your attention to is this display section, because this is where, if you're moving from either 1080p triples, 1440p triples, you will need to make some changes to a couple of these settings in order for the 4K panels to be utilized to their full extent. It's pretty simple. If you're running the resolution of monitors that I am, as in 3840 by 2160, you'll need to do the windowed X position by -3840, because that's going to make sure that it starts the window to the left side of your left monitor. But if you're running 1440p, the number would be smaller because, of course, less pixels. At 4K, we need to move it -3840. The overall windowed width for 3840 by 2160 in a triple 4K setup is 11520. So you'll need to set the windowed width to that value to make sure that it covers all three screens. And then you shouldn't need to adjust the windowed height. The graphics config should have already picked this up, and it should already have that set for you. Now, the other thing, just take a quick look at, make sure the refresh rate that is in here is selected is correct. So for me, this was originally set to 240, but I know I want my panels to run at 120. So I just make sure that that mirrors up in here at 120. And then if you are running HDR, just make sure that this HDR format equals 1 is there as well. If it's 0, just know, you can see here, it'll only be in the the 8-bit color SDR, but if you want to run true HDR display, you're going to need to set it to 1. So other than that, everything is exactly the same to set up as you would any other set of triples, whether it's 1080p or 1440p, but you're just going to need to make sure that your windowed X position windowed width are set to now take into account the amount of pixels that you've got on your triple 4K screens. Okay, so we're in the sim. So at this stage, you have got your changes to your .ini files set up correctly for iRacing. You can see your iRacing in glorious 4K across all three screens, and everything is kind of working as you like it. From this point forth, the setup is really done, and now it just comes down to personal preference on the graphics settings. I've got previous videos where I go through each setting in detail in terms of the level of impact it has, the visual fidelity changes. So I'm not going to do that in this one, but I just want to point you to the settings that I think make the biggest difference and are probably the ones to play with when it comes to optimizing, graphics quality versus FPS when you've got a triple 4K setup. So we're at Bathurst, just because I've been practicing here for the upcoming Bathurst 12 hour. You can see my frame rate just in the right, and that's quite useful to see. So I've got it capped at 115, so it's just kind of bouncing off that. And you can see the R value, which is CPU, down at 1.5, 1.6. There's obviously nothing happening. It's just a practice session with me. But even so, in a practice session with not much action, we're still pushing all of these pixels, and so the G bar for graphics is a lot higher at the 6.8, 6.9. Now in a rain race, when there's a lot of cars around, of course that gets even higher, going 10, 11, but generally it doesn't get much higher than that. But when you are setting up 4K triples and you're in the sim, whether it's iRacing or whether it's ACC or one of the others, it is going to be useful to have some sort of frame rate monitor on screen that you can either record and you can see what's happening, or that you can just see as you're testing, just to see the impact of the graphic settings and to make sure you're going to get a stable FPS across all aspects of the game, from when you're practicing on your own to when you're in a big race and you're on the grid with lots of other cars and pits around you. So from an iRacing perspective, let's jump into the graphics settings and I'll talk you through some of the changes that I make that I think made a big difference when trying to get acceptable FPS without giving away too much quality. So if we start on the left-hand side, one of the first things I did was drop sky and clouds down to low detail. It wasn't a huge FPS impact, but I drove around quite a bit when I was in car, and I honestly just couldn't notice the difference, so I dropped that down. I always keep the cars high. I just don't like losing that fidelity at all, so I always keep that high. Pit objects medium, again, that's the same setting that I would have had when I was on 1440p. But you can see for grandstands, crowds, objects and foliage, I have these all down as low. And when I was running 1440p screens, some of these were higher than that. But again, I made a trade-off between the visual fidelity that matters to me for an immersion perspective and trying to gather that FPS back, and having all of those at low, I felt gave me enough, immersion quality and visual fidelity that I, enjoy driving the car, but it also kind of earned me back some FPS, especially things like grandstands and crowds. If you set those to high, it can have a real big FPS impact whilst you're driving. Middle column, there's a couple of ones here that are real big frame rate hitters, but the first one that I would play around with is probably your anti-aliasing method. Generally going with MSAA is the right one. Again, other video that I've done previously can talk through that in more detail, but that's a good starting point. And I have my sample set to 2 and I have it set to neutral. Now, you could turn this off entirely and you'll definitely see frame rate increases. I felt the visual quality wasn't quite as good, because it's 4K panels. I don't think the impact is as big as if you're running 1080p or 1440p. But as an example, on 1440p, I was running 4x here and neutral. So I have dropped down to 2x and neutral, which is the lowest you can get without going off. Now, you also have soft, neutral, sharp, and simple. Do the research on what the differences are there. Simple will be the lowest hit in terms of FPS, so I could go down to simple if I wanted to here, if I wanted to gain back a little bit more. I felt neutral was a nice balance between it kind of rounding off corners and softening things without taking too big of a performance hit. So MSAA is definitely one to play with, especially if you are struggling to maintain the FPS in game that you're looking for. If you're running at night, shadow maps, object self-shadowing can be quite important too. So a key change that I have made, I do like the shadows, so I've kept them on. However, this number of lights by default is often set to 3. I have moved it down to 1. Did some night races, didn't feel like it was a huge difference. Did notice the saving in FPS though by bringing that down from 3 to 1. Cube map should always be set to off. Hopefully that's the case for you. If not, turn them off. Very little visual benefit, huge frame rate hits. Trees are an interesting one. I played with this for weeks and weeks and eventually just decided to keep them off. You do notice an increase in quality for both 2-pass trees and high quality trees, but it also has a requisite FPS impact. And eventually I decided that it wasn't enough of a benefit visually to have those on. So I kept both 2-pass trees and high quality trees off. We all know iRacing is going through an engine update, hopefully in the next 12 months, maybe it's 18 months, we'll move to DX12, and I think the graphics will take a huge step forward. But until then, those 2 tree setting can give you some more visual fidelity, but you've got to ask yourself, when you're in the car driving, how often are you looking at a tree in detail? And the answer for me was very little. Cockpit mirrors, didn't change this. I like to have the 2 side mirrors active just to bring a bit of immersion, but of course turn those off and you're going to gain back a little bit on GPU, but certainly some more on the CPU as well. So personal preference, but just know you can absolutely run with side mirrors in a triple 4K setup, if you have a suitable and powerful enough system. High detail mirrors, always keep that off. Does make a difference, but again, do you really notice it when you're driving? I would argue not. Again, for headlights, I keep that in low detail. Jumping down to virtual mirror though, this is an interesting one. The bigger the FOV for your virtual mirror, the more taxing it's going to be on the CPU and the GPU, because you're effectively bending that mirror so that it can see more of what's behind you, but also more that's in the side of you. Now, if you don't run any cockpit mirrors, you will need a higher virtual mirror FOV in order to see around the side of the car. So that typically might be set at around 80 degrees. However, if you do run cockpit mirrors, just know that you can get away with an FOV of around 45, and that's almost the more realistic mirror. The only reason I run the virtual mirror and I don't run the in-car screen or the in-car one is just I prefer the location of that virtual mirror because it's in the same place in every car and it's easily in my eye line, and if I wanted to I could actually move that virtual mirror around. So I bring that FOV down. That saves a little bit, but as I said, if you aren't running cockpit mirrors, of course you'll need the FOV higher, which is probably the standard is probably around 80 to 90 degrees, I believe. Key ones in this bottom right hand section. SSR, do not have this on when you're in the car. I can't see any reason in a triple 4K screen setup why you would have this on, because it has such a huge performance hit on the GPU. And it's similar to MSAA. I don't think with a 4K triple setup you should go above 2x in any scenario. And it's the same with SSR. When you're in the car, at least, we'll come on to replay shortly, but when you're in the car, this should absolutely be set to off. You can still see the puddles, you can still get some of the realism, but you just can't afford the performance hit with triple 4K by switching this to either of the settings, either low rain only, high rain only, and then low always, high always. So unfortunately for now, until GPU technology moves on another generation, or SSR just gets a bit more optimized within iRacing, this should always be set to off when you're in the car. Now, these other settings underneath, sharpening, HDR, distortion, heat haze, I would just say personal preference. They will, of course, have a performance hit. Switch them on, drive around, turn them off, see what you think. I think those take effect without having to exit the sim, but if you're not sure, you can't see a difference, always just make the change, get out the sim and go back in. Bit of a pain, I know. I have landed on sharpening, HDR as being the two that I think, add the right realism for me. You may see it differently, and you might be adding distortion and heat haze. The more of those you tick, the more of the performance hit it's going to be. What iRacing talks about here is the impact on video memory. So if you have a video card with enormous amounts of memory, then this might not be as a bigger deal for you. I've got 24 gigs with my 4090, but even so, I just leave those top two on. That's more than enough for me. So let's take a look at the replay tab. Here, of course, you can be more liberal. You're not chasing FPS. You may only be trying to get a minimum of 60 frames per second, maybe even less if you're not streaming and you're not too worried about frame rate. So I have less guidance for you here. If you look through the settings that I have, they do largely mirror what is set on the graphics tab, because I just kind of like to keep it the same. There are a few things that I have different. So if we just jump over here, sorry, the sky clouds, for example, put them on medium. It's a frame rate hit, but again, you know, I'm not looking to keep at 115 FPS when I'm watching other cars or watching other races. You know, I'm more than happy for that to dip down almost as low as 60, to be honest, because it still is fairly smooth, you know, especially with variable refresh rate technology. I put the crowds on medium detail so I can see a little bit more. Objects, high detail, and a lot of it, you know, really is the same. Now, down the middle, no changes here. I still found that if I had the number of lights set to 3, which was what I used to run on the 1440p triples, that it just had too much of an impact for me on frame rate, even in the replay. So I do keep that as 1. And then on the right-hand side here, cockpit mirrors, I switch them all on when I'm in replay. You know, again, add the realism, especially if I'm streaming. I like to have all of the mirrors active when I'm not driving, because again, not so worried about frame rate when you're just watching. And then SSR, which is the frame rate killer, and it is still a frame rate killer when you're in the replay, but I actually think it is worth running it. And just so you know, 4K triples can of course run SSR, and you can run it when you're in the car too. It's just that the frame rate penalty for me is far too great. It's often between 10 and 20 FPS impact, as high as 20 sometimes when it's raining. But when I'm watching a race, I do love the effects that it brings. And in previous videos, I've got me in the car, and you can see the difference of the screen space reflections in the puddles, and it is kind of neat. So I do have this set to low and rain only for the 4K triples. You could probably go higher if you want, but this set of replay settings with a 4090 paired with a 9800 X3D will generally average above 100 FPS in the replay. And then jumping back to the graphics, I do have this set as a frame rate limit as 115, and other than gridding and maybe going past the pits each lap, or a track that's particularly heavy on trees or foliage or just objects around the track, this maintains a really solid almost 110, 115 about 80% of the time whilst I'm driving. So there is no problem running 4K triples and having decent settings in iRacing. Other sims such as ACC could be more challenging to get run effectively, but I'm almost certain, you know, with time and energy and just testing different settings, you can get to the same visual quality. Who knows, when iRacing takes a jump towards DX12, that could make things a little bit more difficult. But for now, I really enjoy the picture quality that I get with 4K. The OLED screens, of course, help with the deep blacks. Really enjoy that. But the jump for me from 1440p up to 4K has been quite significant in terms of my enjoyment and the quality of the screens. So I've loved it. You can absolutely do it and still get a great performance from the sim itself. Don't be looking to hit 240 frames per second, but anywhere between 100 and 115 is certainly gettable, as long as you just don't go too crazy by turning up the graphics settings. That's going to do it for this one. So they're not always easy to set up, but from my experience, I would say they're absolutely worth it. So if you're on the fence about 4K triples, but you've got the budget to make it happen, honestly, I really think it's a worthwhile investment. Just expect to spend a little bit of extra setup time working through some of the stutters if you have them, and just taking the time to do your research and all the different aspects of setup, whether it's Windows, whether it's your sim, whether it's all the way down to the hardware and the cables that you're using to drive the monitors, just to eliminate any points of failure. But once you get there, fantastic. Next up on the channel is going to be a video where I talk through streaming in 4K. That's been a fun thing that I've learned about in the last couple of months as well. Been really enjoying the quality of the streams over YouTube for some of the bigger races. So I will share the different settings I use in OBS to achieve that, some of the minimum requirements when it comes to your network connection. As I know, 4K streaming is bit by bit becoming a little bit more popular. And included in that video will also be a section on overlays and getting them to work with triple 4K screens, which for a couple of months I completely abandoned overlays, third-party overlays that is, because I just couldn't get them to work without introducing stutters. But a couple of weeks ago, I dove back in, figured it out, had to make some adjustments with how I use the overlays in order to get them running smoothly. But now I'm really happy again with the end product and able to put a bunch of overlays on the 4K stream so that all of you and the viewers can see them while still having stutter-free gameplay on my end. So thank you for tuning in, and I'll catch you in the next one.